Oh, good. All right. Welcome. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. A few folks still finding their seats. Okay. Well, hey, great to be with everybody. So good to see so many familiar faces. My name is Greg Bertelson. I am CEO of the Climate Leadership Council. Very briefly, the Climate Leadership Council is a DC-based, nonpartisan nonprofit. We are focused on climate policy. Surprise, surprise. Our focus tends to be on those that motivate market forces for global decarbonization. I am delighted to be joined by an excellent panel of senators and House of Representatives, both Republicans and Democrats. I will introduce them briefly. I will say a few remarks, and then we will turn the show over to our main guests. So to my left immediately is Senator Chris Coons from Delaware. To his left, Congresswoman Kathy Castor from Florida, my apologies, Congresswoman, representing the 14th District, which is an area just outside of Tampa Bay. Congressman John Curtis of Utah, representing Utah's 3rd District, just southeast of Salt Lake City. Congressman Scott Peters of California, representing an area close to San Diego, and Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska. So the topic of today is climate and trade, or said differently, looking at trade policy as a lever for global decarbonization. So why are we exploring this at COP? 25% of global emissions are associated with goods that are ultimately traded across international borders. Now, I'm not talking about shipping emissions. I'm talking about the emissions associated with the manufacture and production of goods that ultimately cross international borders. The policy of the week, or the policy that's been discussed most this week, of course, has been the European Union's CBAM. And in the United States, there is an emerging and growing discussion around this suite of policies, both as a response to the EU CBAM, but also an exploration around a possible US policy. Why is that? Well, as our organization and others have demonstrated, the US economy is actually fairly carbon efficient relative to the rest of the world, meaning that compared to a global average, we produce goods with fewer carbon emissions than many of our trading partners. And so in that, potentially, through trade, is an opportunity to not only lower global emissions, create a lever to encourage lower global emissions, but also reward US businesses who are leading. Really looking forward to this discussion. I am going to jump in to ask a few questions just to get the conversation going. I may interrupt if we get too jargony, but for the most part, I'm going to let the stars of the show be the stars. And so with that, let's get into it. Senator Coons, I'm going to start with you. So take a final sip of coffee. You have now, over the past few Congresses, introduced several different proposals that in one way, shape, or form enter into this space, that in one way, shape, or form seek to use trade as a lever for global decarbonization. You're chair of the Bipartisan Climate Caucus, and most recently, you introduced with Senator Kevin Cramer of North Dakota the Providing Reliability, Emissions Intensity, and Transparency Act, or the ProIt Act, which is a bit of a foundational bill. I'd love for you to start, if you would, with why you decided to introduce that bill and what, in your words, the bill seeks to accomplish.
First, thank you, Greg. Thank you for both hosting and chairing, and thank you for the work your organization does in helping advance credible solutions that can also be bipartisan. Second, this is a bipartisan panel of House and Senate members. Could that get a round of applause, please? That's just not frequent enough. Senator Murkowski and I did a similar discussion 2 years ago at the COP in Glasgow. I'm thrilled that today all of us are here, and I hope this gives you some optimism about the path forward in U.S. leadership, regardless of the outcome of some future election. The ProIt Act that Senator Kramer and I have introduced, and that I hope will soon also be introduced in the House, is about metrics. It's about science. It's about putting some data behind the assertion Greg just made, which is that American heavy industry, our production of steel, of glass, of aluminum, of cement, is cleaner than most of our largest competitors in the world. And as the European Union continues to move forward on potentially imposing tariffs on products coming in from other places in the world, we'd like to make the case to them that we share a common emissions ambition, and that we could and should at some point have a common approach across many countries that are low emissions industrialized nations. If we can find common cause in this, we can find a market mechanism that will help decarbonize the heavy industrial sector around the world. I'm from a state, Delaware, where in the town Claymont, where our current president grew up, there was a steel mill for 100 years. It's gone. I was just at the site of that steel mill a week ago. It is now completely leveled. And the employment that it provided for the community of Claymont for a century is now looking for what's going to be the next act and how it's going to be replaced. If we want to retain steel and glass and fertilizer and aluminum, if we want to retain the heavy industrial base in the United States that has already adapted to strong regulatory standards, then we need to provide market mechanisms that will incentivize the retention and growth of those businesses in the United States. Great to be with you. Look forward to the rest of the panel.
Thanks so much, Senator. I'm going to jump to the end of our stage here. Senator Murkowski, jump to the end of the stage, and also on the other side of the political aisle. You represent Alaska, which is a major hydrocarbon producing state. You also represent a state that is very much on the front lines of climate impact. You are a co-sponsor of Senator Coons and Senator Kramer's ProIt Act, and I'm curious from your perspective, why might this sort of analysis of carbon intensity, a comparative picture of how U.S. producers and manufacturers stack up to the rest of the world, how might that be useful for you and your colleagues?
Well, it is a measure that is bipartisan in its nature because, quite honestly, it's just so common sense. Why would we not want to be able to demonstrate through good, reliable, transparent data that the way that we are operating, whether you're in a place like Alaska or whether you are any place else in the country, the way that we are operating is done cleaner, with fewer emissions, more responsibly? Why would we not want to use this to our advantage? So for us in Alaska, as a producing state, if we're going to continue to be able to produce the resources that we have, we need to be able to demonstrate to people what we know already, that our emissions up on the North Slope are lower than you have relative to other parts in the country. We do not flare our gas. We have re-injection of that gas into our oil wells to get the pressure up. The reality is that we have been producing in a way that has fewer emissions, is cleaner and better. But nobody takes our word for it. So I'm not afraid at all to be part of a process that allows for this kind of data to be gathered. Now, there's a lot of conversation in Congress right now. There's some bills that have come forward, whether it is a price on carbon, whether it is Senator Cassidy and Senator Graham's provision that would be the Foreign Pollution
Fee.
Act, I think is what they have called it. We're moving into a place where there is real, honest conversation, bipartisan conversation about some of these policies. But we should not fool ourselves into thinking that any of them are super easy, that they're not complex, that they're not complicated. And so if we want to get the policies right, doesn't it make sense to get good data to reassure us that this is the direction and the place that we want to go. So I'm in the category, along with 10 other members, bipartisan group, of saying we're going to prove it. We're going to prove how the United States stacks up to the rest of the country.
I want to continue on with that theme, and I want to turn now to Congressman Curtis. You have a really interesting position in this discussion. You're the chair of the Conservative Climate Caucus, of course, 81 members, I believe. So you've had a lot of conversations with colleagues about climate policy broadly, and perhaps a little bit more specifically about this topic. It's been reported that you're contemplating, perhaps with another member of this panel, introducing a House version of the ProIt Act, and I'd love to just get your perspective.
So first of all, the Conservative Climate now has 86 members. We've got to count every one of them. And yes, Representative Peters and I are very close to launching our House version of it. We have the advantage of the Senate going first, and we've been able to see some things that we feel like will increase the likelihood of it getting through the House. So we're not quite dropping it yet, but we're very, very close to dropping that. And if I were back home in a town hall meeting, I think the way that I would explain this is to get your arms around it is imagine walking into Walmart and wanting to buy a toaster. And there's two toasters on the shelf. One's $10 and one's $20. So the American consumer is buying that $10 toaster all day long. What they don't know is that that $20 toaster was made in the United States of America with OSHA safety requirements, with emission requirements, with human rights standards. And the $10 toaster was made in China with none of that. Right? And so the ProIt Act, what we're talking about is not only giving the United States this information, but giving consumers this information and doing a much better job of making the playing field for our businesses in the United States level. We're strapping all of these regulations on them about emissions, about safety, and every other feasible thing, and we're asking them to compete with somebody who has no standards in those categories. And so I think that's one of the reasons this is so incredibly important, is to make sure that our businesses have the same advantage as every other business around the world.
I want to stay on the topic. It's the first time I think anyone has mentioned China so far in their opening remarks. Congresswoman Castro, I want to turn to you next because you've got a really interesting vantage point on this particular topic. For 4 years, you were the chair of the Select Committee for the Climate Crisis, and now you sit on the Select Committee on Strategic Competition between U.S. and the Chinese Communist Party. And there is an obvious intersection between what we are talking about today. And so I'd just love to use that as a tee-up to get your thoughts on this topic.
Well, thank you very much. And it really is gratifying to be here with bipartisan colleagues to demonstrate that we're working together. And it's gratifying to be here at the COP where the United States of America is in a leadership role, and rightfully so. But we want to see a lot of the benefits come home to our own industries. Because right now we're competing against dirty producers that do not hold themselves up to the same standards. And it's time to rectify that. And it's especially important, you mentioned that U.S. products are 40% more carbon efficient compared to products from other countries that don't have the same standards. But that's before America's historic climate law, the Inflation Reduction Act, that is now spurring all sorts of domestic manufacturing along all sorts of supply chains that do involve steel and aluminum. You could say this is also before operation of the bipartisan infrastructure law, where there is a lot of cement needed to make our communities more resilient. So it's very important at this point in time to level the playing field for American industries, but do it in recognition that there is a renaissance in domestic manufacturing going on, spurred on by this historic climate law that is also having the effect of raising other countries' level of ambition. This is also vitally important because there are other countries across the globe, our allies, and friends who would like us to join with them to make sure that we're able to trade and develop supply chains, develop products with these higher standards, and make sure that makes financial sense as well. So I'm, yes, and I think people's eyes are wide open to what Xi Jinping in China does. They don't play by the rules, and this is one way to get into to rectify and make sure that we're recognizing the rules of the game need to be improved.
And I should also note that last week you were co-sponsor of a bill to establish a U.S. border carbon adjustment, so perhaps we can come back to that a little bit later in the conversation. But I'd love now to turn to Congressman Peters. So first, I hope you're okay with me sharing this, but I first sat down with you early in your tenure as a member of Congress, and you shared that you came to the United States Congress to address climate change. And I think that probably is still the case today. I also believe you have worked in one way, shape, or form with every other person on this panel on some form of climate legislation or some form of, and so I think you are well familiar with the folks that have already spoken. But where I'd love you to share your thoughts is you're also very focused on driving market solutions. And so in this conversation, this sort of more global approach, how do you view this from a climate standpoint, as sort of in furtherance of your mission here in Congress?
Well, thank you. First of all, I just want to say, because Senator Coons started with at the beginning, that the bipartisanship is not, it's the only means to the end. When you need 60 votes in the Senate, you need 218 in the House, you need a presidential signature. Nothing gets done unless we figure out how to do it together. And it seems, I think in this crowd, and certainly in this panel, it seems obvious, but there's still a lot of folks who want to pretend that Democrats, for instance, can do it on their own, or that speeches will accomplish the goal. And I just want to say that doing a product like the ProIt Act is really where the action is, and I think really appreciate it. I do believe, look, I believe in markets. If you don't believe in markets, you might want to look at the success of the war on drugs. Markets always win. Markets are surviving and thriving in North Korea. They're black markets, but they're markets. And I've always thought we should take advantage of those markets to promote good results, and particularly around climate change. That's why I think early on I've been trying to advocate for a price on carbon. In many ways, the country's gone a different way with specific tax incentives, specific grants for things that we like, and I think that's okay. I think it would have been more efficient to probably put a price on carbon and let economic actors kind of decide how to respond to that, from the household to the biggest corporation. I still think that there's a role for that. I hope that we consider that in the future. The wrinkle here in the ProIt Act context is that it not having a carbon price and not approaching it the same way as the EU or Canada, for instance, creates a more complicated accounting. And so I think a lot of what the ProIt Act does is it says, how do we measure, let's figure out how we measure carbon intensity. Because at the end of the day, as someone who believes in trade as a way to support prosperity worldwide and to support strategic cooperation and strength, we don't want climate to get in the way of those trade relationships. We want it to be a driver. We want good trade to be a driver both of prosperity and good climate action. And the final thing I'd say is that we've talked about how proud we are of American corporations, American investment. You know, if other countries are doing better than us, I'd like to put a little pressure on ours too to continue to do better. So it offers the opportunity for Europe to say, you know, you got to step it up as well. And I think that's all to the good as well for both our partnership and for the climate. So I'm excited to be part of this effort, and still, you know, I'm not in the majority, so one of the benefits of the minority is I don't have to worry about getting the committees interested in introducing, but I think John's the right guy to do it in the House, and hope we'll have it soon.
Well, I'm convinced, and I think a number of folks in the room are convinced, but politics are tough, I've heard. Climate politics can be tough, and so I want to talk about that a little bit. And Senator Murkowski, I'm going to go to you first. I also know you have to leave early, so but this is something you've thought a lot about. You've spent a lot of time talking to obviously your constituents, but I know you spend a lot of time with young voters as well. For the average everyday citizen, climate is a confusing and intimidating topic. And being able to relate in a way that speaks to people's concerns is important. And I'd just love to get your perspectives on how you think about this when it comes to communicating with your constituents. What have you heard from your voters on climate, and more specifically around some of these topics?
Well, thanks, Greg. You're right. Climate politics is tough. But when I'm home, when I'm talking to people, when I go out to the villages, when I am talking to people on the lower Yukon about the loss of the fish, the salmon in the river, for them, there is no politics in climate. They see what they see. It is a reality for them. And so they become confused when I try to talk about the politics of it. Because for them, it is about their food security, it is about their financial and economic security, it is about their cultural security. And so don't talk to me about the politics of it, Lisa. What are we going to do? Imagine, as an elected official, you're dealing with your constituents who are facing a disaster when it comes to food security. And they say, I don't care about the politics. What are you going to do to get more fish back in the river so that we can feed our families? These are some of the reality checks that I have. So when I go back to Washington, D.C., and we get caught up with the politics, I have to take my head back to these conversations where for them it is a matter of practical life that they are facing. And so they want to know, how can you make my community safe from the erosion? Talk to me about what we're going to do to make sure that we've got a seawall to hold the sea back. And so for them, what they want to know is, talk to me about this infrastructure bill, because that's going to make a difference here. When we're talking about resilience, they don't want the fancy words. They want to know, how are we going to keep the utilidor, where we protect our water and sewer lines, from caving into the ocean so that they don't lose access to their water. So it's challenging when I'm back in Washington, D.C. It's not so challenging when I am home and I recognize the imperative of what they're asking me to do. And so I will step into the political fray. I will be there with unlikely friends and allies, although Chris Coons and I are not unlikely friends and allies. We team together far more often, and it's always a good thing.
I'll give you a chance to respond.
But it's important.
I concur.
It is important that we, again, work to find the consensus. And I think, as just about everyone has mentioned, there is not going to be any enduring climate policies unless we're working that together. And so again, for my constituents, they don't want to know what the Republican plan is. They don't want to know what the Democrat plan is. They want to know, what's the plan?
Yeah, thank you for that. Let me go back to the ProIt Act for a moment. Staying on the politics theme for a second, Congressman Curtis, you've got a unique position when we're thinking about how to start to build a broader coalition around this kind of an approach. And one thing that I think is important for folks to consider as we're talking about a bill that is really to present data to lawmakers is that there are a number of use cases for this. I mean, we've been talking about climate and trade policies for the U.S. perhaps, but that's not the only use case for this. There's other stuff going on in the world. The EU is working on their CBAM. Can you talk a little bit about how this kind of analysis might be appealing to some of your Republican colleagues?
Yeah, I can. So I think first of all, if you look at it from the perspective of the CBAM coming at us, do we really want to rely on Europe's numbers when that's imposed upon us? No, we don't. So that's mission number one, is we ought to be relying on our own numbers. And I would agree with Scott on this concept of, hey, let's find out if we are really, really strong in 5 categories and weak in 1 category. Let's take that challenge, right? We shouldn't be afraid of that, and we should find out exactly where we're at. And I think my colleagues will relate with that. And then we come back to that initial comment that I made on the toaster, which is Republicans can really connect with this concept that really the only way to hold China accountable is through a trade policy. I'm asked all the time, like, how are we going to deal with China's emissions? And I have really 2 answers for that. One is, if we are the ones who have a low-cost solution that lowers emissions, they will buy it, but it has to be low cost. And number 2 is trade policy, right? So how do we hold China accountable? Trade policy. Republicans like to hear that.
Thank you for that. I want to turn to our Democratic colleagues here to ask the same question, because I think it's easy to remember the challenge in bringing the full Republican Party along with some of these policies, but there's tension on the left as well. And so maybe I'll turn to each of you just briefly, because you've each, in working to find common ground, of course, run into opposition on the left or flank. And so perhaps we could just turn to each of you just to share your experience and how you might communicate this to those on the left who might find some reservations with some of the things that we were talking about today. Senator Coons,
I don't understand what reservation there would be to having data, to knowing how well our manufacturers are doing. Frankly, whether it's the steel workers or the steel manufacturers, in the conversations I've had in the United States and overseas, there's no opposition to the idea that we should prove it domestically and internationally that we have some of the cleanest manufacturing in the world. There are criticisms, perhaps, I'm trying to guess what you're asking, from the left that it doesn't go far enough, that we should be more ambitious. I have no quarrel with that, but I want to get bills actually signed into law. I want to see policy actually advance. And if there's a common message I've been delivering across all my engagements here, it's that American leadership in combating climate change is going to continue, regardless of the outcome of the next election. And I think it's important that we have Republicans and Democrats on this stage saying we're intending to continue to move these legislative solutions so that the world can have confidence in our sustained leadership. The Inflation Reduction Act has put in place some of the greatest incentives in the world for reducing emissions. We need to match that with permitting reform, with investments in manufacturing innovation, with deployment at scale of new clean technologies. And yes, to agree with what both Scott and John have said with our entire panel, if we can use trade policy to advance American interests and the global interest in emissions reduction, we should.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just to be a bit more specific, and Congressman Castor, I think this is you're the appropriate person to answer this question. China is the world's largest emitter, about 30% of global emissions. U.S. is second, right? And so I think some of the critique from the left has been, are we simply punting our responsibility to continue making progress? And I don't think that is the case. I don't think anyone on this stage believes that's the case. But I'd love to sort of get your response to that critique.
Yeah, I think when it comes to trade policy in climate, people are looking for tools to press China to reduce the pollution. And I don't hear a lot of hesitancy among Democratic colleagues, but what I think is happening is this idea of a carbon border adjustment mechanism is just something the average member of Congress does not understand what this is. And I'm going to ask for your help to talk to members, because now it's going to become a more frequent point of dialogue, because our businesses at home need it. They've been doing the right thing, reducing pollution. Our allies across the world have some of these mechanisms in place. They want the U.S. to be a better partner with them. And so to that end, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse and Congresswoman Susan Del Bene from Washington State and I have been working on the Clean Competition Act. Senator Whitehouse is a well-renowned leader in the climate space. In the House, if you asked any of our colleagues what is a carbon border adjustment mechanism, they simply wouldn't know. But we want to help explain. This is to level the playing field. Just like our historic climate law, the Inflation Reduction Act is a patriotic investment in America, in our domestic manufacturing. So would a CBAM, or Clean Competition Act, that would do the same thing. It would level the playing field so that dirty producers overseas are encouraged to up their game. And so that's where I think the weakness is among some of my colleagues.
Thank you. Congressman Peters, you and Senator Coons were one of the first members of Congress to introduce what I'll refer to as a border carbon adjustment only bill last Congress, the FAIR Act, and really got a lot of this conversation going. And I know you got a lot of feedback, some positive, some negative, and I'm curious how you interpreted that, how that shaded your thinking or has shaped your thinking since.
It's struggling to remember the negative feedback we had. The policy is good climate policy and it's good business policy. If you want to make sure that other countries are living up to their climate pledges, it's good policy. If you want to make sure that your companies are not being disadvantaged, it's good policy. And I suspect maybe Chris has more insight into why we changed the course, but we didn't really. We're sort of still on. It's sort of still the same thing. I do love working in a bipartisan way. I would just. It is remarkable to me, as I think, as John said, we want to get something passed. Yeah. So it's always this not enough. You get all the people on the extremes, and it's a age of great populism and public involvement. But really, it's about getting stuff passed. So I'm optimistic that we could do this. I always say. I want to get things passed. I'm from San Diego, California. I don't go to Washington, D.C. for the weather.
Congressman Curtis, you had a comment.
Yeah, I want to point out when you talk about kind of obstacles, a little bit of problem for Republicans is that this, a fear that this would lead to the carbon tax. Yeah. And I just want to be really clear that this is a study. And today we're not talking about a carbon tax. We've talked about could this be used for a border adjustment, or more importantly for me, is this is a good tool to just let our businesses know and our consumers know the differences, and for Europe when they do the CBAM. But I just kind of want to put that out there that I think really, if we're honest, in both parties the carbon tax has had a problem. But I know specifically with Republicans it's been very problematic. And we're not here today saying, look, we want to do this because it's going to lead to a carbon tax. I just want to be really clear with that. It's really important that it's not interpreted that way back home.
Yeah. No, it's a really good point. I mean, this is an exercise in better data, better information, which should inform better policy. And we've talked about a number of the use cases already, but you can see by the members who have already stepped out on it, there's a variety of positions on what the use might be, but at the end of the day, let's get the data and let's help you guys do your jobs better. I want to shift focus a little bit. We've talked quite a bit about China. We've talked a lot about the benefit to U.S. manufacturers in this space, but here we are at COP. We're with 200 other countries. Cooperation is sort of the spirit of this event, and so I also want to come back to something, Senator Coons, that you said at the beginning, which is ultimately finding a common approach, because in this arena there is an opportunity for cooperation, and so I'd love for you to speak a little bit more about that.
Look, we're at a period of time where, because of the impacts of globalization, the WTO system, global commitment to free trade has faced some real challenges, in particular because of the impacts on Middle America and on the result of the deindustrialization of a lot of the United States. The ProIt Act is a chance to get data. and it's a chance to build a data-based effort at harmonizing the climate policies of 200 countries. We have conversations going on about what's the future of trade and what's the intersection of trade and climate, but to just respect what John was saying a moment ago, the ProIt Act is just about gathering data. Data for transparency, data to prove what we're doing in the United States. I personally might think that a price on carbon would be a very positive thing for our economy and for the world, but that's not what we're endorsing today. And it's important that folks not misunderstand what this broad bipartisan commitment to data and data transparency is about. Our politics on climate have been tough. We have not been able to get both parties aligned around a shared vision for climate. This is a next step in getting data that will allow a variety of different policy solutions, and I'm open to all of them.
And sort of similar but related, Congressman Curtis, I want to just come back to you for a second, because you talked about levelizing the playing field, and I think that's an important thing to remember, is that our industry, our regulatory environment is robust. It's a robust regulatory environment. And so there's a combination of factors that has led to the United States' what we'll call carbon advantage. But not every country plays by those rules. And I know that's really important to you as you enter this space, is how do we start to think about levelizing the playing field for our manufacturers and our businesses? And I wonder if you could just speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah, thanks. And it goes back to this idea of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the CBAM. And let me make clear, I also want to make sure that the record is very clear on carbon tax. So I led the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis for 4 years. We did a deep dive. We came up with 715 recommendations. Over 400 passed the House. Over 350 were enacted into law. It's a lot of the basis of the Inflation Reduction Act and some in the infrastructure law. We did not recommend, after hearing from everyone, a carbon tax at all. That was not in our recommendations. As the IRA turned out, it has a lot to do with incentives to businesses. And that now is reflected in this renaissance across the country in domestic manufacturing. And huge capital flows into communities. A lot of these are in red states and in Republican-led districts. So they're starting to see a lot of these clean energy investments pay off. But that's why it's important now to come on top of it with some new measures to counter the dirty producers in the world that are competing on an unlevel playing field. We want to level the playing field, and that's why working with our allies, you can put a new carbon border adjustment in, and then take those proceeds and have them flow back into American industries to help expand those businesses and employ more workers and bring justice across the country. That's our vision. I think it's a patriotic one.
I agree. So we're running close to the end of our session. Really grateful for the members who have spoken today. We've got time for just one more comment, probably about a minute each. And so you can take this anywhere you want to with your minute, but I'll offer you one cue, which is what's possible in the near term. So we're entering the silly season, 2024. Congress is divided between parties, among parties. Your jobs are challenging. So how do we measure success looking to next year? How do we measure success a little bit longer term? Or anything else you haven't said that you want to say? So there's your open-ended question, Congressman Curtis. That was not on purpose.
Nice.
That was not on purpose.
Announcement.
But if you do want to make news, no, Congressman Curtis, please.
Yeah, I think this is just a really good time to just double down. It's been said. I'm gonna. If I get my end comment, this is what I'm gonna end with. Like you see a bipartisan, bicameral group up here talking in harmony about goals and objectives, and when that happens, anything is possible. So I just would compliment my colleagues for participating with us and being here. And I would hope, look, if you forget everything else about what we've said today, go home and say, Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, we're up there talking about a shared vision of how to move forward. I think that's really important.
I'd like to see, I think there's a real possibility in this particular issue to make some progress. This is really well teed up. I think it makes sense from a lot of perspectives, and I hope we do it. The previous hour I spent talking about permit reform. I think in a divided government, there's a lot of possibilities around that. And if you heard that panel, I mean, I think you may not have understood that we actually advanced the ball a little bit just in that hour. So I think it was useful. And those are the two climate-related things I'd like to see happen. I'd also just remind people that when you look at a stormy ocean, you think, I wouldn't want to be out there on a boat. That's a lot of what it looks like when you watch TV and when you think about Congress. But there's a lot of fish swimming underneath the sea without worrying about what's on the surface. And a lot of the folks here are the ones who are trying to get things done without being too caught up in that. And that's why I think there's some hope.
Thank you. Congressman Kessler.
Great. Well, thanks again for the opportunity to be here. I would beseech you to interact with members of Congress and give them real-world examples on how ProIt and a carbon border adjustment would help lift their businesses and who they're competing against in the world. Because this is an urgent moment. Coming from the state of Florida, we again had the warmest year on record. This summer was oppressive. The water in the Gulf of Mexico and by the Keys is like a jacuzzi. People are really grappling with higher costs driven by the cost of the climate crisis. And I believe it's the United States of America and our leadership that's going to help lead the world out of this and solve it. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Coons, final word.
American leadership in combating climate is real, is sustained, is significant, and will continue. And if you take one encouraging thing from this panel, it ought to be that serious and engaged senators and members of the House on a bipartisan basis are continuing to advance legislative ideas in partnership with an administration willing to enact them. So please, to the extent folks are watching the choppy surface, give them some optimism that beneath the daily waves of what you see on Fox and MSNBC, there is a tremendous amount of meaningful work going on that will continue going forward. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you. Thank you to those of you in the audience. Really appreciate your time today. Appreciate you making the trip, but mainly appreciate the thoughtful approach that you each take every day in Congress. You represent us well. Please join me in thanking this panel.